Joining us now is Jed Horne. He is the author of the book Breach of Faith, Hurricane Katrina and the Near Death of a Great American City. He was city editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper when Katrina hit. Mr. Horne, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, my pleasure, Rachel.
What is your reaction when you hear President Bush say that the federal response to Katrina was not slow?
Well, I think if you're looking to rewrite history, you ought to attend to more than the photo ops. I mean, it really is astonishing, I think, to us here in New Orleans to hear this kind of chatter when, in fact, the situation was so much more dire than any trip to Baton Rouge or New Orleans by Air Force One could possibly have remedied. And in reference to the Coast Guard, no one here disputes that the Coast Guard did spectacular work. It remains to wonder then why, given their performance, the rest of the federal apparatus was so slow, so retarded. Why days later Mike Chertoff still evidently didn't know that there were levee breaches in New Orleans, that there were people seething and in fact dying in front of the convention center. Why it was that they evidently didn't know that the storm could be lethal to 60,000 people, or claimed not to know that, when in fact tapes released later on showed Bush getting the update on Sunday in Crawford, in which those kinds of casualty numbers were very much part of the conversation.
There is, as you say, broad agreement that the Coast Guard performed courageously in the wake of the storm. With the research that you did and what you experienced during Katrina, in your estimation, if you could pick a lesson for the federal government to have learned from Katrina, the worst thing that they needed to make sure to never do again, what would you have had them learn?
Well, I think they need to learn, above all, to give federal agencies some leeway, some autonomy to function efficiently and expeditiously. What happened almost immediately, and this was, you know, as the blowback to Bush became deeply embarrassing to the administration, everything became political. And thereafter, for 3 years to this day, a very toxic kind of partisanship has shaped the federal involvement in the Katrina mess, and it remains a mess to this day. It was, you know, particularly unfortunate to see squabbling late in that first week over whether Bush could get Governor Blanco to capitulate and somehow throw the state National Guard into the arms of the federal armies that were still not reaching New Orleans at that time, as though this would reveal her own shortcomings and in that way shift blame from the Bush administration. And it just went on from there. Efforts to draw invidious comparisons between Blanco and the good Republican Haley Barbour over in Mississippi. Proportionally huge amounts more of money heaped on Mississippi per capita than on Louisiana, despite the far greater need, of course, in Louisiana, the far greater devastation here.
Mr. Horne, President Bush gave that speech in Jackson Square about 2.5 weeks after the hurricane hit, pledging famously that he was going to start working on poverty, he was going to start working on the legacies of racial discrimination. This far out from Hurricane Katrina, the residents of New Orleans are still living in a city that is dramatically changed by, dramatically hurt by that storm. Is there any sense that he has kept any of the promises that he made in that speech, any of the post-storm promises?
Well, there have been things done down here. Make no mistake about that. The housing projects were reduced to rubble at a time when many people thought we probably needed to save them for a time in order to have low-income housing available to the workforce that was, at that point, unable to return to the city. Work has begun on the levee system. 2 years after the storm, we finally got, and there have been endless studies and all sorts of drum roll, we finally were told what the Bush commitment would be to flood defense. And the astonishing thing, really, from the perspective of New Orleans, was that the commitment was to protect the city from a 100-year storm. Now, that sounds good. You know, you figure one storm in a century. In fact, a 100-year storm is a term of art. There is a 1% chance of a 100-year storm happening in any given year, or perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, as happened in 2005 when Rita followed Katrina. In fact, a 100-year flood defense is not enough to have protected the city from Katrina. Katrina was a 300-year storm 3 times the strength of the storm that now, somewhat grudgingly, the federal government has agreed to shore us up against. The Dutch and people like that who take flood defense really quite seriously are flabbergasted by this sort of feckless, lackadaisical response. The Dutch had their Katrina in '53. They have fortified their coast against weather events that can be expected once in 10,000 years. That's a flood defense 100 times as strong as the one that the Bush people, and it's still unfunded, have promised New Orleans.
So the best case empty promise scenario is that New Orleans would not be protected if this happened again. Incredible. Jed Horne, author of the book Breach of Faith, Hurricane Katrina, and the Near Death of a Great American City. Thank you very much for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you, Rachel.